I still feel that it's very emotional reading that book for me. Like I cannot even, like I'm reading the introduction and it's already make me cry. Like, oh my God, I understand how, I mean, like it's very difficult. And I read another chapter and oh my God, there's a story about the survivor, which is I always imagine my family when I read that.
Hi, I'm Ileana Chan, and this is the Ignoramus's Guide to Surviving Humanity. I'm here with my co-host Wei Chan.
Hi.
And two amazing guests. We have the American journalist and author of this book, the Jakarta. Oh, is that mirrored? It's the Jakarta Method by Vincent Bevins. So
Amazing.
This is Vincent Bevins, and he's talking to us from Berlin in a Syrian cafe. So that's the ambient noise that you may sometimes hear. And the Indonesian journalist, Febriana Firdaus, I hope I said your name correctly, who is talking to us from Bali. Thank you both for coming.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Thank you.
And I just want to say that this is the Ignoramus's Guide to Surviving Humanity. I personally am pretty bad with names and dates and also facts. So if you catch me saying anything that's incorrect, just please just correct me. So I'm not spouting misinformation. Okay, so let's start with just basically why this is called the Jakarta Method, what the Jakarta Method is, and why Jakarta and not, like, say, Guatemala or whatever. So we get an idea of what this book is about.
Sure. Yeah. First of all, thanks so much for having me. The book, To the Jakarta Method, is about anti-communist mass murder. It's about the intentional extermination of people for being leftists or accused of being leftists. And although Indonesia 1965, the US and UK backed slaughter of between 500,000 and 1 million people is not the only or the first episode in this story. I think it's the most important story, the most important episode in this story, I think. And the term Jakarta enters the Cold War vocabulary because after this massacre in 1965 in Indonesia, other right-wing groups around the world, either anti-communist groups, allies of the United States, potential allies of the United States, took inspiration from what happened in Indonesia. And in Chile and in Brazil in the early 70s, they started using the word Jakarta to denote this plan, this method, this thing that they intended to do to their own leftists. And this did happen in Chile and then elsewhere throughout South America and Central America afterwards. So Indonesia 1965 is not only, I think, one of the most important victories of the Cold War for the side that ultimately won. It inspired this sort of metaphor, metonym that took flight in the 70s and 80s.
It also seems to be the biggest event I've never heard of in my life, to be honest.
How big is this event? Like, let's just say.
Well, yeah, as I said, between 500,000 and 1 million innocent people were slaughtered, and Indonesia, now the world's fourth largest country by population, one of the real leaders and founders of the Third World Movement, flipped entirely from being a left-leaning anti-colonial power to one of the most fervent anti-communist countries and one of the closest allies of Washington in the Cold War. So it's a really, really big event, I think.
And so, when I was talking to Febriana earlier, I think we both had this question kind of, and correct me if I'm wrong, Febriana, you can correct this, but I was a bit like, how did an American come to write about this topic? Like, why? Yeah, why? So really, could you tell us a little bit about that? How did you even come to this idea?
Yeah, well, Febriana herself, I mean, I'm really honored that she's here too, because she was a huge help to me at the very beginning of this research when I didn't know anything. I still would not claim that I know very much about the actual Indonesian story. So I wasn't an expert on 1965 Indonesia when I started, and I'm still not now. And she provided huge amounts of help of connecting me to the sort of the real activists and victims and scholars that have been working on this for decades. What I saw my role here is that I got to Indonesia in 2017, and technically my job was to cover the region for U.S. newspapers, for the Washington Post primarily. But I found that lurking below the surface in whatever I was doing, whatever story I was trying to work on, was this bigger story about 1965 in Indonesia. And when I looked closer at it, I realized that it was not only something that Americans didn't really know about, number one. So that's again, as you know, basic journalistic practice. That's number one. This is something that's important. Number two, I realized it was something that my own government was deeply complicit in, that had committed really horrible atrocities. And number three, and this was the weird sort of random thing, is that it connected to other parts of the world where I had lived before, where I know the languages, where I was able to sort of make a connection that perhaps not everyone would be able to make. So I saw my role here as kind of just taking the narrative that had already been established by experts in Indonesia, like, on Indonesia, like John Rusa, Oscar Wardaya, Bradley Simpson, taking the work, building on the work that activists and survivors have done for decades, and then just sort of globalizing the story, taking really the basics, not trying to retell it, not trying to do a better job in any way, but to insert it into this larger story of the Cold War, to make primarily people in my country understand how important this was, and the degree to which my government, the government that technically we have democratic control over, was complicit in crimes against humanity.
Wow. And then that's kind of how you ended up meeting Febriana. So you did, to an extent, work together on the fact-finding mission for the book, or how did that work?
I met her before, right? I think that's right?
Can I
Febriana?
just
yeah, please
jump in there and actually ask Febriana this question? So what went through your mind? What went through your mind when you got this email from? I guess, like, what were you thinking?
Yeah,
this email from an American journalist.
I'm just too serious on everything. So, because I'm a local journalist, I know, like, I'm Indonesian journalist, and I cover like various issues in my country, from Aceh to West Papua, I think, and so many like foreign journalists email me, right? Even like the editor want to interview me. So I didn't really reply to all that email. And I feel that I'm also like having something that I'm doing. So I didn't reply, if I'm not mistaken, like his email like for like 6 months. The first time his email, because I have this very bad image of foreign journalists.
yeah
Yeah, I have so many like bad experience with them. Even like the foreign journalists who never traveled to West Papua, they're trying to mansplain me. So I have like the same opinion about at first, even like before I knew Vincent. So I just think like, oh, Vincent, just another foreign journalist email me. What's the point? And then I saw him on Twitter. I saw like his article, and I did a little bit research. It's a little bit creepy, Vincent, but I didn't. But I was just like, I have to be careful. No one taking advantage of me, like what happened to me before. Like people just want to contact, people just want to come to my country for his career. I have like this very bad opinion about the foreign journalist. But then just I saw him, and I saw that he mingle with the I know I have so many friends in Indonesia that who he met even like in abroad. Like I know exactly, because everyone told me, do you know Vincent? We met Vincent. I was just like, oh, okay, he met this guy. Okay, oh, he tried to mingle with the networking, like trying to write a story, and then I finished all my deadline, and then I decided to reply the email, and that's how we met. And then, okay, I think he's serious about this writing, and then I have all the source that he wants if he wants it. So I just like talk with one of the very senior Indonesian exile, in Germany, and I say that shall we give him like a chance? Yes, okay. and then I just like introduce like some source. I think very important in the beginning of the research of his book, and then he can continue after that.
Mhm.
So there is like a lot of like screening. Actually, I didn't give it easily. Like I know exactly, like I know if I help him, like he will. I want the book also. Like I think I told Vincent that I really want that if you write story about 1965, think about the victim, because it's the victim is like the story is not you, but the victim.
Right.
So yeah, so that's what happened.
How did you find out about Febriana, Vincent?
Oh no, I mean everybody knew. I mean everybody knows who Febriana is. So when I got there, she was. I mean, I guess through social media and just the community of journalists working in Jakarta, she's a major figure, and she had an organization called Remember 65. So she was absolutely somebody that that was a clear sort of she was a road to any kind of work you want to do on this. And I should add quickly, I mean, like Febriana has a very coherent critique of international journalism in Southeast Asia and the global South, and I think it's basically 100% right. I think sometimes we have the tiniest of disagreements, but I mean, it is absolutely right to be suspicious of a white American man that shows up in Jakarta. Like, so if I had written this book just based on sort of declassified files and sort of what was in the public sphere, it would have taken me much less time. I took a lot of time slowly trying to meet the people that really cared about this, convince them that what I was doing was good. And then they introduced me to the next level of people who introduced me to the next level of people, which allowed me to actually base the story around the survivors. And it was important to me that that the people who really cared told me that it's that it's worthwhile. If everyone had said stop, don't do this, that would have been an entirely different issue. So there was a very so Febriana was one of the very first people that said, okay, we'll see what you're going to do. I'll introduce you to this person, this person, this person. And I kept going slowly and slowly and slowly. Eventually, I think a full year after this conversation she just described, moving to Solo for a while and just like living near a lot of the survivors and explaining to them all of them what I was doing, and just to so slowly get to know who actually really wanted to be a part of this. And because people like Oscar Wardaya or Winarso, who runs the survivors organization in Solo, because they kept saying yes, 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 keep going, I felt a lot more confident doing it. But yeah, but she was a huge like bridge to cross. I mean, not like it was thought about in that terms, but in retrospect, she made a lot of the initial research possible and introduced me to a lot of people, which, as she rightly points out, foreign correspondents should not be awarded automatically. Like just because somebody shows up and says, "Oh, I'm doing this," like there's very especially. I mean, we could talk about like the politics of foreign correspondence for the whole time if we needed, but coming from South America to Southeast Asia, I was very disillusioned with the process. I mean, in South America, the role of a correspondent is a little bit different. And in Southeast Asia, I saw a lot of things that are really not encouraging. I mean, there's a lot of times that I thought, like, what is even the point of having Western press out here? The relationship is, I mean, I say this often sometimes, that the Jakarta Method is not only about the formation of a neo-colonial global order, it is also published into one, right? So I'm also a part of this story, right? Like the fact that a book that comes out in New York will make a bigger splash than one that comes out in, let's say, Cambodia, is related to the things in the book. And yeah, the situation for Western journalism in Southeast Asia, I think, really justifies the skepticism that Febriana just described.
I'm really interested. Oh,
yeah, because there's on one hand, there's this idea of like, well, you've got Western journalists, they're just going to push the imperialist agenda. they could be working for the CIA.
Yeah.
Like, we don't know. There's that part of it. And then there's the other element of it, which is, I think, Febriana, if you could talk about this too, your own experience about speaking publicly about 1965 and the consequences to your life and career. If you could expand on that and why people would be very hesitant to talk about this event.
Yeah, it goes everything. When you write about 1965, I lost my job. So I lost my job, and it's very traumatic. Even until today, I try to cope with that trauma. So we are dealing with a very powerful Indonesian military, right? And then they have like people everywhere, like including like no one of the president like can ignore that power, even like Jokowi. So for a journalist, I saw like I realized that not so many journalists wrote about that, but that there was an event, the International People Tribunal in The Hague in 2015, that it changed everything. At first, like I felt conflicted because my family was part of the story. Then I was thinking that I think like every Indonesian is part of the story. I shouldn't feel like conflicted with that, because can you imagine like 1 million people killed, and then
At least, right? We don't
yeah,
even know the
yeah, we don't even
amount.
know that. Yeah, maybe like the number is bigger. So every single Indonesian is actually have a story about their family getting kidnapped or killed. Like first example, with my family. So I think that I convinced myself at that time I shouldn't be afraid to write about it and feel conflicted, because every Indonesian is part of story, so not only me. So then I report about that story, and then I broke the news, and then I think like my article went viral, until like the retired military general who get involved on that operation came to me and said to me like, I don't like your article, I don't like everything that I did. He came to me, and then I got intimidated by the Islamic Defender Front, and then my office didn't defend me, and then I was depressed because my family said they were afraid, and they uh, asked me to stop being journalist, which is that's like the biggest thing that make me depressed, because its family should like support me, and it's very hard. So it's 2016 I experienced. So I think like it's before I met Vincent. So 2016 I experienced like a very like I attempt to suicide. That's what happened. So it's really like, so why I didn't reply your email also, Vincent, because I trying to cope with my mental health issue as well. After I lost my job, I don't trust anyone. I had a trust issue, like this foreign journalist emailed me talking about 1965. It's very traumatic.
Yeah.
It's very, very traumatic. So I try to like get myself together. So that's like the cost that I have to pay for writing the story. And even actually when I write the story, and I wrote the story, when I wrote about the International People Tribunal, and I heard all the testimony, I was crying. I was crying. I was crying because I imagine my grandfather and the other my family member. And even like when I read Vincent book, so I promised to finish it before this. I can't, because I keep crying when I read it. Even like in introduction, I cannot stand reading this book.
Yeah.
I cannot finish it like that fast, because it's just heartbreaking story. I still feel that it's very emotional reading that book for me. Like I cannot even, like I'm reading the introduction and it's already make me cry. Like, oh my God, I understand how, like it's very difficult. And I read another chapter and oh my God, there's a story about the survivor, which is I always imagine my family when I read that book.
That's such a good point. Like, I mean, it's called the Jakarta Method. It's about the CIA and everything, but I also found this book very emotional.
Mhm.
Yeah.
It was emotional on so many levels. Like, yes, you're talking about the survivors, you're talking about the consequences of these horrific events. And also, it is the other thing that was moving to me and really was just this idea of like, oh, you've been gaslit your entire life. And
Mhm.
then a book comes along and is like, hello, actually, you're not crazy. These things did happen. And the
Yeah.
CIA and where Washington was part of it. So, yeah, it's amazing. The other thing too is I like reading your articles that you sent us in. We got them Google translated, and it just the symposium was supposed to be about why did 1965 happen, and the fact that you did the reporting on it and then lost your job.
Mm.
Just the irony of that situation and the I did want to think, like you were saying, you didn't think that it would have those effects, though, writing the article at all.
Yes.
Yeah, so the bravery of it, nevertheless. So thank you for that.
And at the date, no one published that story. So many journalists in that symposium building, and only me published that story. I didn't know what happened in the newsroom across the country, but no one published that story, only me. So it's crazy.
Wow. And you didn't know that it was going to have those consequences. So
Yeah, and I suggest like I mean like I predict like I don't know, maybe there was a self-censorship in the
Mhm.
news. So I'm not sure, but there's only me, like so many like dozen journalists there in the press conference, and it's only me published that story. And after like I got the intimidation, and then it went viral, and then other media report about my intimidation, which is like
Mhm.
right.
not the core of the story. The story is
Mhm.
about the symposium,
Right.
like this group of Islamist militant with the retired general trying to like show their power that so it actually like the respond to the International People Tribunal. So that group like they like initiate this symposium. They are trying to tell the Indonesian people, no, it's not right. Like Indonesia is not guilty because this
Mhm.
the International People Tribunal, the verdict say that Indonesia is guilty.
Did you you're talking about kind of the domestic reaction to your article and how the domestic media handled the situation. Do you also have views on how you were treated by the foreign media and as people in the UK? And I guess the podcast will go out to people, in the English-speaking world. What was your view on what kind of shaped your suspicion of foreign media? Or you did touch on it, but maybe you could just talk a little bit more about that.
In general, foreign media in general.
Yeah, or specific experiences. Like
it's up to you how much
did you think that they had did you think they had agendas, or did you think that they were trying to get sound bites from you and take them out of context, or did you just have a general kind of feeling of
In my own experience,
mm-hmm.
my editor really rely on me. So if I say that this is, yeah, you can go with this, so it's not going to happen because they don't know anything about Indonesia. So they rely on me. So when I say that we need to revise this. So I don't think like personally I experienced that because they know that I'm like very expertise on my own country. And also like I'm like, I always like speak everything that I feel that this is wrong, like this article is wrong. Like for example, the virginity test, the one of the Indonesian journals say that there will be no virginity test in Indonesia for the military.
Yeah.
The fact that there is no institutional statement, so there is no statement from the institution of the Indonesian military, but I think he just used it to like promote his own career as, I don't know, he want to run as a president. So I don't know. So I think like I give my opinion to my editor. We have to be careful.
Mhm.
Next time. But I don't know like the other journalists. But like what I told you, like many foreign journalists is trying to take advantage of local journalists. It's happened to me. And even I don't get paid, and I
So I see.
so many
Mm.
story, and also I got mansplained. But newsroom, I work with so many great editor. I'm mostly from the UK.
Okay.
Mostly from the UK. So they
Mm.
they really respect me, but not in my case. I don't think I experienced that. But I don't know other journalists.
Yeah, and to just give a little more detail on that is that Febriana has written for The Guardian. So apparently the editor at The Guardian is not as horrible as me and Wei thought. At least
No,
We
I
sometimes
think
have
like
beef with the Guardian, yeah.
I have like one editor, but I cannot tell. It's not professional. I know some editor are very racist. They only give the assignment to the native speaker journalist, right? Inside to me, even though I know a lot about, like for example, West Papua, but they gave it to the journalists in UK. And the way that they pick the angle of the story usually like very bombastic, but not actually necessary for Indonesia. So that's actually some of the article. I think it's for clickbait, not for like necessary for like this is what actually the journalists matter for the journalism matter. No, but yeah, it's happened for like some foreign media. They just want like some clickbait and bombastic, and then yeah, I think like I don't think it's necessary. So sometimes I feel like so weird sometimes if my editor asks me to write about it. So I personally will refuse to do that and I say, okay, you can assign, but not me. And I don't need the money as well. So that's what I always like always say to my editor if I don't feel comfortable. Always say to them. So I don't have a problem with that. I just like refuse to do that.
Okay,
Amazing.
so do you have any such dilemmas, Vincent? I mean, I know you've written for the LA Times, for the Financial Times, and the Washington Post. And now I think in the US, basically, the distrust for mainstream media is like at an all-time high.
Right.
And probably rightly so, because of a lot of the, a lot of the reporting is more like state reporting, I guess, like it seems like. But it's not across the board, right? I'm assuming your work with these. Well, anyway,
No,
tell
I
me a
mean,
little bit about your experience and your thoughts on that.
the dynamics that Febriana described are all present, and they're all much worse than they were when I started. I mean, I'm not that old, but I started in international journalism, I guess 2007, 2008, and everything's worse. So I mean, I'm not going to say which publications or which editors, but I have definitely lists of people that I will never work with again because they prioritized a headline that is clickbaity over what I know to be the story. They ask you to do work and then disappear. Again, this could be an entire conversation, but the economics of international journalism are headed very much in the wrong direction, and they have been for a long time. And what that means is not enough people in offices in New York and London are kind of deciding in advance what the story is, right? Because they don't have the money or resources to employ someone like Febriana full time. You know, like ideally that you would have somebody that it is their job to tell you what's happening in Indonesia. What happens more often these days is somebody in New York already knows what they think the story is. They find somebody on the ground. Sometimes it's local. Sometimes it's like a rich kid from like that went to Oxford. That's kind of like having a gap, like a lot of foreign correspondents now.
Oh my god! Yeah. Oh my god!
It's kind of like a modern way to do a gap year. Is
Oh my god! It's true.
No.
As long as you graduate from Oxford, everything will
Yeah.
be smooth.
Yeah,
Oh
you
my
get,
God.
because it used to be, okay, we have a veteran who's been in the field for 10 years. He speaks Indonesian and Portuguese, whatever. And now it's like, okay, here's a 22-year-old whose parents are really paying for them to go live in whatever, Kuala Lumpur. And they just kind of want to get their name in the Guardian once, and then their name in this place once, and then they're going to go back to London and work at a consultancy or like whatever, join the Labour Party.
Yeah.
And like, and that all has to do with the economics of the production of news and the production of knowledge, right? Like, I mean, I worked at the Guardian, and I worked at the Guardian offices 10 years ago, 2009 and 10, and I won't say too much. What I think is like, you know, undisputable is that there's less people for the same amount of work. And when you have parts of the world that are so complex and so unknown, like Indonesia is, right? Like the average American comes to, like we were discussing before the recording started, the average American, you tell them you're writing about Indonesia, they go, hey, well, what? Polynesia, Micronesia? When you're dealing with a country that is totally unknown, you really need to take the time to have someone on the ground, like explain from the beginning the story. And when you're trying to put out 20 pieces of news a day, you know, all of it, which are designed to generate maximum clicks, you just will not do a good job. And then you end up relying more and more on freelancers. You pay them less and less. You don't have somebody on the ground like Febriana is describing to say to the editor, no, this is really what the story is. It's not what you think. It's not what you saw on the internet. This is really what it is. And the less we have of that, the more of a one-dimensional view of the whole world we have, which is basically dictated by the ideological priors of middle management in newsrooms in New York and London.
So you think it's less? Sorry, go ahead.
And remember when Trump was president, is all this story, like almost all about Trump. And I was just like so upset because, oh my God, Trump is everywhere and everything. Like even like, oh my God, there is like a story about the Trump hotel, like whatever, or like whatever related to Trump is become a headline. I think like, oh my God, there is so many stories in Indonesia. And also like not only Trump, like every single thing about Trump is headline in like American media. And I think, yeah, it's important, but like, there are so many stories like environmental disaster in my country, climate change people, but like they don't really prioritize that. And I was so upset because when my editor said, Trump, do you want to write? No, I don't want. I don't know anything about Trump in Indonesia.
Where to write about Trump?
No, well, they found a way. I mean, this was. I mean, I'm not gonna name publications or editors or whatever. But when I got
obsessed with Trump.
Yeah, when I got to Southeast Asia in 2017, it was like everything that they wanted me to write about. Certain people, certain publications, won't say who, it was really supposed to be about Trump. Really, like whether even if it was something in the southern Philippines, it was really like, well, isn't this being done by Duterte, who's a bad guy in the same way that Trump is a bad guy? Everything was really just about the Trump issue. You could never tell a story on its own terms. And I was just like, what are we doing out here? Like, what's the point? But yeah, so I just want to, I'm just agreeing with Febriana.
Now Trump's not president anymore. It's so great that all the world's problems have just disappeared.
Yeah. America's back. America's good again. You can just close your eyes.
America's back in Vietnam.
Kamala Harris says, did you see Kamala Harris put flowers down at the what she believed to be the memorial of John McCain, but it was actually a statue dedicated to the Vietnamese that shot him down.
Oh God!
It's just typical.
Yes.
It's just typical American brain. You go around the world and you assume everything is about how you're good, without realizing that the other side of this conflict has its own narratives.
Oh my God. Who is the fixer? That we need to talk with the fixer.
What, and high five them?
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, someone is out to get Kamala.
Yeah, they set her up. Amazing.
I think that actually is true within Washington, but it's a separate issue. I think Kamala doesn't have a lot of friends, but everything ends up being about yourself. I mean, this is human nature anyways, right? Humans are always gonna, whatever they see, they're gonna be thinking about themselves first. That's just a flaw of our species. And so when you have everything dictated from newsrooms in the North Atlantic, then everything just ends up being about the North Atlantic, even if it's theoretically happening on the ground in Myanmar.
So you're kind of suggesting, and I suppose it might be like 50% of this, or half, like this, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. But that it's kind of like a little bit of like lack of resources, time crunching, clickbait, economic reasons.
Right.
And then the other reasoning that I think is, and tell me if I'm like far off base, what your thoughts are on this. Like basically what is covered in the book, the sort of agenda of Washington in the book, is still sort of ongoing, but they're sort of pivoting their messaging towards, well, I mean, it's always been China, but now there are different factors involved in that messaging. Yeah, so tell me a little bit about your thoughts on that and how it's sort of evolving.
Yeah. So as I said, what I do in the book often is just kind of rely on the real experts and then put things together in a global way. And there's this one very good historian of the Cold War at Harvard, I believe, Universidad. And what he says is, if you look at the history of the United States, this is a country that has been engaged in aggressive expansionist militarism at every single point in its history. So it happened to be that in the Cold War between 1945 and 1990, communism was the big bad enemy. Before that, it was often Black or indigenous, it was indigenous people in the United States, it was Philippines, it was Cuba, it was Central America. And in the post 9/11 era, just kind of the war on terror, Muslim terrorism just got slotted into the same enemy grouping that the communists had put in the Cold War. And I think probably the next one is China. I think we're seeing a reorganization of forces to really focus energies on China. And again, like it's the same people, it's the same it's the same institutions, right? Like one thing I always try to underline about the Cold War is that, like, if you look at the people, the states and institutions which carried out very real human rights abuses in the communist world, at the very least, they don't exist anymore, right? In the case of the United States, it's the exact same institutions, the CIA, the State Department, the same media. It's like there's a direct line from the things that I'm speaking about the book to the people that will be prosecuting a Cold War against China. Now, to the answer, what I think is the other sort of part of the question is like, how do these things evolve? I think if you look at the 50s and 60s, the period that I look at most closely in the book, the United States is kind of like a young and bumbling imperialist. Like they're very like, they have a lot of money, but they don't have a lot of nuance or subtlety. So the way that they do things is they show up with a lot of money and they try to bribe the military to do this or that. They try to buy an election. They try to bomb things. It's very clumsy. In the 60s, the classic military coup involved literally tanks rolling into the Capitol and expelling the elected leader. And then it's very obvious what's happening. In the decades since, things are a little bit more subtle. Often you see the use of judicial or parliamentary or media assaults in support of whatever regime change operation that you're trying to carry out. So if you look at the case of Bolivia, 2019 to 2021, this is a real case in which you can see the Jakarta Method reproduced, but also in a more mature form, right? Like you have very classically a leftist government, which has been very popular over its rule in Bolivia, and then is eventually overthrown with the use of the military. But it isn't just so clear that the military says we're doing a coup, right? There's this constellation of forces which are clouding the scene, saying, okay, well, there was electoral irregularities, okay, there's protests, okay, he's overstepped his bounds, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's very hard for people that only know the history of the 70s or that don't know the history of the 70s rather very well to recognize, oh no, this is a coup. Just because they say that there's problems doesn't mean it's not a coup. And then we just got a report a couple weeks ago that finally, all of the most conservative and sort of, establishment organizations recognize that this regime that was in power from 2019 to 21 carried out torture and execution of political prisoners, or sorry, of its political opponents. So while they didn't do it, the coup took place in a different way than it would have in the 70s, you still have the same dynamics at work. You still have a State Department, which is going to be more likely to look the other way if you have a leftist being removed from power. and you have the justification of human rights abuses if you're taking care of quote unquote like radical dangerous elements, in this case, often just indigenous people in Bolivia. But it's kind of in its more mature form. The United States as a hegemon is more confident now, and it's developed a very wide array of tools in the period since it kind of took over the world at the end of World War II.
Scary.
Right.
So scary. Yeah. Febriana, I was watching your documentary with my parents and we loved it. Our Mother's Land.
Yes,
Yeah.
our mother.
And a lot of the women who were who you were interviewing in this documentary, they were talking about capital and how they see the fight as them versus capital. I was wondering if you could give us your take on that, and then a little, because this is the stuff about the media and the media bias, and also how this plays out on a global scale and how the US protects its interests and capital basically also plays out on a domestic stage in your documentary.
Yeah, I think my documentary trying to give a voice to the vulnerable communities, or like these voiceless people or communities, which is like the woman, that I think like they get like less coverage from the Indonesian media, because usually when you cover a story, you only focus, like for example, protests against the giant company like palm oil. They only focus in a group, but they didn't tell like the detail, what is the impact to the this vulnerable community, women and children. So I try to like give a voice to this woman in my documentary, and even like put them as the heroines, which is like in the spotlight, that even the woman like they are in the front line until to this day. So I don't know, your question is about related with the US something.
Oh, I can't remember, but yeah, it just made me think of it.
Yeah, because basically what struck me from your documentary was essentially, this happens in Malaysia as well. I mean, it happens all over the world, is corporations come in to areas. Yeah.
So I think, it's still related to what happened during 1965. So actually, under the Sukarno regime, we have these agrarian reforms initiated by the father of one of the senior Indonesian exile that I introduced first to Vincent. We have to keep her name in secret because she didn't want to get any spotlight. So this his name is a vice of the chairman of the Indonesian Communist Party, initiate agrarian reform. So it's like the first concept to balance, not to balance actually. Yeah, the concept of communism, that we don't want to we don't want our nature to be controlled by the corporation. So when the Suharto coup Sukarno, then that's like the first the early year when the corporation have like such great access to all these Indonesian natures, because we are very rich. So for like 32 years, under the Suharto regimes, this corporation like built this empire in Indonesia, which is exploit all the nature. So my documentary also still related to that. But I cannot tell to the audience actually that it's related to what happened like Sukarno coup by the Suharto. It's just too complicated. But some of the story took place it's happened like it's still like in before the Suharto fall, right? Like for example, the one in Sulawesi. But all these corporations actually settle during the Suharto. administration. So this like after the Reformation. So this woman is trying to, I think, like organize a movement against this corporation, and it's still happening until today. I think like even though Suharto fell, but I think the new, we can still feel like the presence of the new order through this corporation and company, Indonesian military working with the corporation or palm oil plantation or like coal company is still happening until today. So that's like the legacy of Suharto.
I mean, and really to go back to the book, it just seems like if a country doesn't fall in line, does not actually fall in line with capitalist corporate interests, if they do decide to go towards more socialist, progressive, no, these terms sometimes don't mean anything anymore, but sort of like more egalitarian type of systems, the US is going to come in and dismantle your democracy. I mean, is that a fair assessment of what's going to happen?
So, yes. I mean, in we could break down exactly like, the various components, but I think land reform, as Febriana points to, is really a big one. I mean, if you step back and take a look at all of the regime change operations, coups, things like this that happened in the 20th century, the best predictor of them one happening, or if you really want the United States to come and mess with you, land reform tends to be a theme that runs throughout this. I mean, land reform was an issue in Guatemala in 1954, Indonesia 1965, Brazil 1964, and so you say that if you don't get in line, there's a very interesting distinction between the countries that really do have to get in line and the rare exceptions where you're kind of allowed to break those rules. Now, if you look at the rare examples of the countries that actually did move from being maybe the so-called third world countries to first world countries, they were given exceptions to these rules. So like, for example, when the United States comes to your country and the United States is like actually running your economy and they want you to succeed, they will do land reform. So like South Korea is a really good example of a country that operated outside of the rules, which I think applied to most of the rest of the global South, went from being a very poor country after World War II to now one of the richest countries in the world. Again, Japan, the United States pushed through land reform when the United States was running that country. However, if you try it in a country where the process is going to threaten US corporations, or the process is going to be perceived as inimical to the construction of the US-led capitalist order, then you could be in real trouble. So you have this bizarre thing where if you try to do something in Guatemala that the United States actually did in South Korea, you're going to be branded as a communist or as an enemy of the global order. And again, that makes sense because you are an enemy of the global order. In the period from 1945 to 2000, you see the slow but deliberate construction of a US-led capitalist order. And one of the most important rules of that game is that property rights should be global. So if you have US companies or European companies that are operating in your territory, by insisting on your sovereign right to control your resources in your country, as the leader in Iran did, leadership in Iran did in 1953, or Indonesia did in the mid-60s, or Guatemala in 1954, you are kind of breaking the rules. And then, when you break the rules, there's all kinds of punishments, and they'll start off with smaller things, but then they'll build up to the worst things if those things don't work. I think that's another thing that Americans have a hard time understanding when I talk about a US-backed mass murder of between 500,000 and 1 million people. There is kind of a how do we put this, like a process of starting with the more, let's say, moderate punishments, or the more low level sort of the things that are supposed to stop you, right? So in Indonesia in 1955, they start bribing right-wing Muslim parties. That doesn't work. They try to foment and participate in the civil war. That doesn't work. It's only when things get really, really hot that they turn to these more extreme measures. But yeah, I mean, I think that you did see the construction of let's call it a rules-based liberal order from 1945 to 2000, except that some of those rules are you cannot infringe on property rights of investors in the global north.
Okay, so can you explain land reform to me?
Febriana, do you want to explain the
A little
Indonesian
bit.
land reform, or should?
Yes.
It's very complicated. I
Oh
think you can
no.
when I there was a rule that you cannot own a land more than 5 hectares. It's like 5,000 meter.
Yeah,
Yeah,
we have hectares. Yeah,
hectare.
yeah.
Yeah. So most of the owner of the land that access to 5 hectares is like a Muslim cleric in Indonesia.
Mhm.
I think that's like when it started the anti-communist sentiment. So Islam is anti-communist. So I have an argument with Islamic Defender Fronts on Twitter before I delete it. I say that because they accuse me as anti-Islam. I say, hey, Haji Misbah is a Muslim and he is the member of Communist Party. Don't you say that
Yeah.
in the Communist Party is like anti-Islam. So don't try to get the audience lost with that. So Indonesian Communist Party is not anti-Islam.
And maybe just to take a step back globally, like where in the other places, in the broadest terms, like land reform is about moving from feudal to capitalist property relations, right? So in Marxist terms, yeah, that would be feudalism and capitalism, but even like liberal, and everybody kind of agreed on this, and basically in a lot of the global South, and even Europe, if you look back, it used to be that land was held by one person or one family that would have a huge piece of land that they would often quite inefficiently farm on, and then they would extract rents from peasants, right? So like this was the classic thing with Mao and the landlords in China. The landlords would just have a huge amount of land. Everyone would be forced to work for them, hand a surplus off to the feudal landlord. In Brazil, these were often literally feudal, people, people that were given their land by the empire, the Portuguese crown, right? So in Britain, you had to do this too. You had to get land out of the hands of giant, unproductive feudal lords, and then break it up into smaller pieces so that it'll be operated on along capitalist lines. The idea being when you have people actually owning their own land, working on it for their own profits, it's going to be not only fair to them, but much more efficient for the production of capitalism. So a lot of these leaders that were trying to carry out land reform, they were explicitly trying to develop capitalist property relations. This was not like the first step necessarily on the way to communism. Although, of course, in both China and Vietnam, you had very bloody land reform policies. But yeah, I mean, Brazil, a lot of my work in Brazil is about the fact that this didn't happen. The exploitation of the Amazon to this day has a lot to do with these still existing feudal property relations that the land reform of the 1960s did not resolve because it was stopped in its tracks by US-backed coup. So in both Indonesia and Brazil, environmental issues are related to this sort of unresolved question of land reform.
Thanks for watching part 1 of our interview with Vincent Bevins and Febriana Firdaus. We will be back next week for part 2. In the meantime, catch Febriana's documentary Our Mother's Land. We have links in the description and in our bio, and also links to all her other articles and the article on the symposium that we reference in the interview. Also, buy this book. It's available literally everywhere, but we've put the publisher's site in the description and in our bio. So, see you next week.